billionaire stood in front of hundreds of people and laughed at a single father for spending $700 on a rusted trailer. She called him foolish. She called him poor. She made sure everyone heard it. 48 hours later, she was standing in his driveway alone, offering him $100,000 for that same trailer, and he still said no. What was hidden inside that rust and dirt was something her family had spent 50 years trying to make the world forget. This is the story of what $700 actually bought. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week we bring you stories that will shake you, move you, and remind you that life is stranger and more powerful than anything you could script. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button, get comfortable, and don't you dare leave before the end. The auction started at 7 in the morning, which meant Nolan Pierce had been awake since 5 because he was excited. He had stopped getting excited about auctions 2 years ago, after he'd paid $340 for what a seller described as a complete set of vintage torque wrenches, and opened the box to find 3 rusted ratchets and a cracked socket the size of his thumb. Experience had a way of beating the optimism out of a person. He was awake at 5 because Mia had a nightmare. She wouldn't tell him what it was about. She was 7, and she'd reached the age where she decided some things were private, a development that both impressed him and broke his heart a little. He sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and rubbed her back until her breathing slowed, and then he stayed another 20 minutes, just to be sure. By the time he was certain she was really asleep, his own chances of sleeping again were gone. He made coffee in a pot that had a crack in the handle and only worked if you held it at a specific angle, and he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of 4:50 in the morning and looked at the auction listings on his laptop. His shop, Pierce Automotive, occupied a converted 2-car garage behind the house, a house that needed a new roof, had a back porch that leaned about 6 degrees to the left, and still had a water stain on the hallway ceiling from a leak he'd patched 8 months ago, but hadn't had money to fix properly. The business was not failing. That was the most honest way Nolan knew to describe it. It wasn't failing. It was simply never quite far enough from failing to let him breathe easily. He did solid work. His regulars trusted him. But he wasn't the kind of shop that attracted the big restoration contracts or the high-end clients. He was the kind of shop where people brought their second car or their grandmother's sedan or the truck that needed an alternator, and he charged them a fair price and sent them home with something that ran right. Kept the lights on. It kept Mia fed and in school clothes that fit. It didn't leave much room for anything else. The auction that morning was a liquidation sale, the contents of a warehouse that had belonged to a machine shop that went under 6 months back. The listings showed mostly industrial equipment, pipe stock, and a category listed simply as miscellaneous automotive, condition unknown. That phrase, condition unknown, was either a treasure chest or a trash heap, and the only way to find out was to show up. Mia was awake before her alarm. She appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15, wearing her yellow rain boots and a sweater that had a cartoon dog on the front, her dark hair tangled from sleep, still clearly not fully conscious of the world. "Are we going?" she asked. "We're going." She didn't ask where. She already knew. On Saturday mornings when school was out, she went where he went. Was their arrangement, unspoken and understood. Found that kids understood more arrangements than adults gave them credit for. He poured her cereal and made her eat it sitting down instead of carrying the bowl while walking, which was her preference, and a preference he consistently overruled. By 6:40, they were in his truck, a 2009 F1 150 that had 211,000 miles on it, and a driver's side window that wouldn't roll down all the way heading toward the warehouse district on the east side of Greenford. The warehouse was already half full when they arrived. These things always drew a particular crowd: dealers looking for resale stock, hobbyists looking for parts, and a category of person Nolan recognized immediately as the professionals. You could spot them by the way they moved through a space. Deliberate, eyes scanning without their heads moving much. They'd done this 1,000 times, and they were here with a number in their head already. Mia held his hand without being asked, which she only did in crowds. He didn't comment on it. The miscellaneous automotive section was in the back third of the warehouse, beyond rows of metal shelving and stacked pipe, through a set of heavy rubber doors that swung both ways, pushed through and stopped. Most of it was what he expected. Engine blocks in varying states of disassembly. Racks of old stock that probably hadn't been moved in a decade. Transmission cores stacked on wooden pallets. The usual archaeology of a machine shop that had slowly stopped acquiring new things and started living off what it had. But in the far left corner, separated from everything else, sat a trailer. It was long, maybe 18 feet, with a low-profile chassis that was almost entirely hidden under layers of surface rust and grime, so thick it looked almost deliberate. Kind of rust that didn't happen by accident. The wheel covers were mismatched. Someone had welded additional cladding along the sides at some point. Crude work. Nothing aesthetic. The kind of thing you do when you need something to look like less than it is. There was a padlocked steel panel along the right side that someone had mounted after the fact, riveted directly to the frame, and the lock was an old one, a heavy brass thing that had gone green with age. Looked at it for a long time. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking at. Something about the basic lines underneath all the rust, the curve of the fenders, the width of the chassis, didn't quite match the junk it was trying to look like. He crouched down and looked at the underside. The frame members were heavier than they needed to be for a trailer of this size. Custom fabrication, not factory. He stood up and found the registration sticker on the tongue. It had expired 23 years ago, and the name on it had been partially scraped away. He could make out the first 3 letters of a last name, P-I-E. He stood there for another minute, then wrote down the lot number. The auctions itself ran for nearly 3 hours, and most of it was boring in the way that most auctions are boring, unless the specific thing you want is being bid on. Bought a set of brake drums for $45 and lost a bid on a decent floor jack by $10 to a dealer he recognized from other sales. Trailer came up near the end. The auctioneer ran through it fast. The way they do with items, nobody wants a quick description. A starting price that was technically a question, an expectant pause that got no answer. "We'll start at 200, the auctioneer said. 18-foot flatbed trailer, miscellaneous automotive contents, sold as Ziz, inspection guarantee. 200? 150? Still silence. People had drifted away. The serious buyers had gotten what they came for hours earlier. $100. Somebody give me $100. Raised his paddle. There was a pause, and then a voice came from his left. "You're wasting your money." He turned. The woman who had spoken was standing about 8 feet away, and she was not the kind of person who typically appeared at a Saturday morning liquidation auction in a warehouse in Greenford. She was 30, maybe, dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark pants that weren't from a department store. She had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who've spent enough time being the most powerful person in any room that they've stopped adjusting their posture for anyone. Her hair was pulled back, and she wasn't wearing much jewelry, but what she was wearing was precise. Kind of precise that has a price tag. "Excuse me?" Nolan said. "That trailer." She nodded toward it without looking at it. "It's worthless. Whatever you're seeing in it, you're wrong." She said it the way someone states a weather fact. Unkind, exactly. Just certain. Men in your situation can't afford to gamble on junk. In your situation. He noticed she hadn't actually looked at the trailer when she said it was worthless. "Thank you for the advice," he said, and turned back to the auctioneer. She kept talking. He wasn't sure why. Maybe she was used to people engaging with her when she spoke. "I'm serious. I've been to 100 of these. Whatever story you've built up about what's under there, it's just rust. It's always just rust." 700, Nolan said to the auctioneer. There was actual laughter from the people nearby, maybe 15 or 20 who'd stayed for the end of the sale. "Someone," said Season. The woman didn't laugh, but something moved in her expression that was the shape of a laugh without committing to one. "Sir," the auctioneer said, with the tone of a man who was grateful, "do I hear 700? You do." Silence. "To paddle number. Men like you." The woman said, yet louder now.
Yes, sir.
"Yes, Tinund. And there was something beneath the certainty in her voice that he couldn't quite name, are the reason these auctions stay in business. You buy the things the rest of us know to leave alone. She said it clearly enough that people heard. Some nodded. Some smiled. One man outright laughed. Nolan looked at her. He had things he could have said. He was good with words when he needed to be, though it wasn't something he showed often. Could have asked her what she saw when she looked at the underside of that trailer frame, since she hadn't looked. He could have asked why someone who found the trailer worthless was watching so carefully when his paddle went up. He didn't say any of it. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he took Mia's hand and walked to the registration table to complete the purchase. Waited until they were outside before she said anything. That lady was mean. She wasn't having a good morning. You don't know that, he admitted. I don't. He was loading the paperwork into the truck's glove box when he heard footsteps, sups on the gravel, and turned to find the woman from inside walking toward him. She'd come out a side door. The walk was direct. She wasn't someone who wandered. I'll give you 1,000 for it, she said when she was still 10 feet away. Looked up from the glove box. You just told a room full of people it was worthless. 1,500. He turned around and faced her. Daylight, she looked slightly different, still the same controlled presence, but something around the edges was off. Like a painting hung 1 degree crooked on the wall. I'm not interested, he said. 5,000. He felt the number land somewhere in his chest. $5,000. He ran it. Without meaning to. It was just reflex. It was 2 months of the shop's normal income. It was the roof. It was most of Mia's school clothes for the next 3 years. It was oxygen. He looked at the trailer on the flatbed of his truck and then back at the woman. $5,000, he said slowly, for something you told everyone in that room was worthless. She didn't answer that. She knew she'd walked into it. 20,000, she said. And that was when everything changed. Because at 5,000, a person could still construct a story. A whim, a project she'd thought of. A business reason she hadn't mentioned. 20,000 had no story. 20,000 was not a whim. 20,000 meant she had a number in her head, and that number was still much higher than 20,000. I'm going to need to know your name, Nolan said. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her calculating whether giving it helped or hurt her position. Brielle Carrington, she said. He'd heard the name. Carrington Automotive was not a company you didn't hear of if you worked in this industry. 3rd generation. Annual revenues that got discussed in business articles he'd read over lunch in his garage when the afternoon was slow. She was the CEO. Had been for 6 years since her father stepped back. He understood now why she'd come to a liquidation auction in person. Whatever was in that trailer, she hadn't wanted to draw attention to it by sending a proxy. He said, Mr. Pierce, Nolan Pierce. He said it without drama. Very still for a moment. She stood very still for a moment, and he had the impression she was doing something unusual for her, which was adjusting to a situation she hadn't fully prepared for. You don't know what you have, she said. No, he agreed. Not yet. He closed the truck door, helped Mia up into the passenger seat, and drove out of the parking lot without looking in the rearview mirror. Did not look in the rearview mirror because he was fairly certain she was still standing there. And he didn't want to know what her face looked like when she watched him leave. His neighbor, Dale Pruitt, helped him unload the trailer that afternoon with a borrowed pallet jack and a great deal of commentary. Dale was 58, retired from a career installing HVAC systems, and had an opinion about everything, which he delivered at a consistent volume, regardless of whether you'd asked for it. That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen parked on this street, Dale said, walking around the trailer with his hands in his pockets. And I'm including the Hendersons' Christmas decorations. I didn't buy it for how it looks. What'd you pay? $700. Dale made a sound that wasn't quite a word. You get taken by that woman? Nolan looked up. What woman? The one who was parked down the street for about an hour this afternoon. Real nice car. Just sitting there. Dale gestured vaguely toward the end of the block. Gone when I came out to check the mail. Nolan didn't say anything about that. He walked the length of the trailer, slowly, running his hand along the side panels, looking at where the additional cladding had been welded on. Up close, in his own driveway, in better light, since he could see things he hadn't been able to see at the auction. Yes, he'd intervened. The welds on the cladding were sloppy, but the welds beneath them, the original frame welds, were something else entirely. Precise, the kind of work that took real skill and time. Whoever built the underlying structure of this thing had known exactly what they were doing. Weight distribution was wrong for a cargo trailer. He'd noticed it on the drive home, the way it tracked, the way it settled. Whatever was inside wasn't distributed the way cargo would be. It was concentrated toward the front, specific, deliberate. He knocked on the steel cladding along the right side, above the locked panel. The sound that came back was not the dull thud of sheet metal over empty space. He knocked again, in a different spot. Something was in there. Stood in the fading afternoon light in his driveway, with the sound of Mia doing homework at the kitchen table drifting through the screen door. And he thought about a woman who owned a billion-dollar company driving to a warehouse district in person and offering $20,000 for a trailer she'd publicly called worthless. He thought about the registration sticker with the name scraped away. PIE. He thought about his father. Arthur Pierce had worked in automotive fabrication his entire adult life. He'd been good at it, exceptionally good. From what little Nolan knew, from what pieces he'd assembled over the years from people who'd known him. But he'd died when Nolan was 9, and the story of his career had died mostly with him. What remained was impressions. A man who was careful about his work. A man who didn't talk much about the people he'd worked for. A man who in the last years of his life had become very quiet on certain subjects. Had never thought much about that silence until now. Took out his phone and photographed every inch of the trailer before it got dark. Called Gideon Shaw on Sunday morning. Shaw was not a close friend. He was the kind of person Nolan knew through the industry, a retired automotive historian who'd spent 30 years cataloging race car history and now ran a small consultancy out of an office full of filing cabinets that he claimed. Organized, but nobody who'd seen them believed. He was 71, drove a car that was probably worth more than Nolan's house, and had the particular gift of being able to identify a vehicle component the way a doctor identifies a bone from an X-ray. Sent him the photos first, then called. Shaw picked up on the third ring. "I've been looking at these since you sent them," Shaw said without preamble. "Where did you get this?" "Liquidation auction. Greenford machine shop that closed." A long pause on the line. "Those frame welds on the interior structure," Shaw said slowly. "Can you get me the measurements on those cross members? I need the exact spacing." "Can do that this afternoon." "And the panel on the right side, the locked one. What's the lock mechanism?" "Old brass padlock." "Maybe 1960s. Another pause, longer this time. "Nolan." Shaw's voice had changed register in a way that was hard to describe. Like he was trying to stay careful with something that wanted to move fast. "That sticker on the tongue. You said it started with PIE. Your father's name was Arthur Pierce." "Yes." "He worked fabrication in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Before you were born. He did a substantial amount of contract work for..." Shaw stopped. "For who?" "For Carrington Automotive." The silence between them stretched out until Nolan became aware of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and a bird doing something persistent in the yard. "I need to come see this in person," Shaw said. "Tomorrow. Open that panel. Don't let anyone else open it." He paused again. "If I'm right about what I think I'm looking at, you need to understand that a woman named Brielle Carrington is going to come after you with everything she has." "She already started," Nolan said. The silence on Shaw's end had a different quality then. Surprise. Something closer to confirmation. "Don't sell it," Shaw said. "Not for any number she gives you. Not yet." Nolan looked out through the screen door at the trailers sitting in his driveway. Rusted patient. "I don't plan to," he said. He hung up and stood in his kitchen and tried to remember everything his father had never told him. Couldn't remember much. That was the problem with silence. It didn't leave you anything to hold on to. It left you with the shape of an absence, and way to fill it. Yes, a locked steel panel in your driveway that maybe, just maybe, held the answer to why a man had spent his whole life being less than he actually was. Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair catastrophic. "Who were you talking to?" "A man who knows a lot about old cars." She thought about this. "Is it about the ugly trailer?" Yes, sees. She considered that for a moment, with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old who has decided a thing matters. Good, she said, and went to find her cereal. Gideon Shaw arrived at 8:40 the next morning in a dark green Jaguar that probably should have been in a museum itself, wearing a corduroy jacket with a pen mark on the left cuff and carrying a canvas bag that clinked when he set it down on the driveway. He was a tall man, slightly stooped now in his 70s, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and come out the other side, looking like it meant something. He shook Nolan's hand with a firm grip and immediately walked to the trailer without another word. He walked around it once, slowly, not touching anything. Then he walked around it again, stopping at specific points, crouching down to look at the underside the way Nolan had done the first day. He pulled a small flashlight from his jacket pocket and aimed it at the frame welds, and he stayed there for almost 3 minutes without speaking. Stood back and let him work. Mia had gone to school, which he was relieved about. He didn't know what this morning was going to look like, and he hadn't wanted her there for the uncertainty of it. Shaw finally straightened up, both knees complaining audibly, and he turned to look at Nolan with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "When's the last time you ate breakfast?" Shaw asked. "I had coffee. That's not breakfast." Shaw picked up his canvas bag. "We need to talk before I touch anything else, and I'd rather do it sitting down." They went inside. Nolan's kitchen was clean in the way that single-parent kitchens often are functional and organized out of necessity, not aesthetics. There was a drawing Mia had done, taped to the refrigerator, a crayon portrait of the two of them standing in front of the garage that had given Nolan longer legs than he actually had. Shaw looked at it briefly while Nolan poured coffee. "Your daughter?" Shaw asked. "Mia's. She's 7. Shaw nodded and sat down at the kitchen table, setting the canvas bag on the floor beside him. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and looked at Nolan directly. "I need to tell you something about your father," he said. "Some of it you may know. Most of it I suspect you don't. He worked for Carrington Automotive. He did. From 1968 to 1971. 3 years." Shaw set the mug down. "Arthur Pierce was, and I'm not saying this to be generous, I'm saying it because it's accurate. He was one of the most gifted fabricators working in American motorsport in that period. Well known. He wasn't someone who promoted himself. But the people who worked alongside him knew what he was." Nolan said nothing. He was aware of a particular quality of stillness that had come over him, the kind that happens when you're hearing something you've wanted to hear for a long time, and you're afraid that moving will somehow interrupt it. 969. Shaw continued. Carrington Automotive was developing an experimental race car. This was not a public project. It was not announced. Carrington family, at the time Brielle's grandfather, Edmund Carrington, had made significant investments in their production automobile line, and they had also set in the for reasons that were both financial and reputational, made commitments to certain industry partners that limited what they could publicly do in motorsport. Shaw paused. Plain language. Yet they were in a relationship with a consortium of manufacturers who had agreed, informally, that nobody would develop performance technology beyond a certain threshold. Was the kind of gentleman's agreement that doesn't get written down anywhere. And they were breaking it, Nolan said. Edmund Carrington was trying to break it quietly, yes. He'd commissioned a prototype, completely off the books. The idea was to develop the technology privately, then introduce it gradually into their commercial line in ways that couldn't be traced back to a single development project. Shaw picked up his coffee again. They called it the Phantom Arrow. The name landed in the kitchen, like something that had been thrown from a distance, and finally arrived. Arthur Pierce built it, Nolan said. It wasn't a question. Arthur Pierce built the better part of it, yes. He led the fabrication. The chassis, the body, the aerodynamic elements, things that didn't exist yet in commercial automobile design. He was working 3 years ahead of what anyone else was doing. Shaw's voice had the particular quality of a man who had spent his life around machines and had learned to love the people who understood them the way others love music. The Phantom Arrow. In the testing that was done before everything fell apart, ran times that wouldn't have been matched by production vehicles for another 15 years. Sat with that for a moment. What fell apart? He asked. Shaw set his mug down carefully. The consortium found out. The specifics of the car, but that Carrington was developing something. There were consequences. Financial pressure. Threats of exclusion from joint ventures that the Carrington business depended on. Edmund Carrington panicked. Shaw paused, and something moved in his expression, something old and unhappy. He ordered the project terminated. He ordered the prototype destroyed. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a truck went past on the street. And my father was supposed to destroy it, Nolan said. He was given the order directly. He was the lead fabricator. It was his work to undo. Shaw looked at him. He didn't do it. Looked down at his hands on the table. Instead, Shaw said he disguised it. He added the cladding, the rust treatment, the mismatched parts, turned a prototype that had taken 3 years to build into something that looked like nobody would want it. And then he disappeared from Carrington Automotive. Notice, no confrontation. He just didn't come back one Monday morning. And from what I've been able to gather over the years, nobody went looking very hard. Because they thought it was destroyed, Nolan said. Because they thought it was destroyed. Nolan stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the trailer sitting in his driveway in the morning light, ugly and rusted and patient, exactly as it had been, for every day of his life he could account for, in one form or another, without him ever knowing it was there. Father had been 31 when he made that decision, almost exactly Nolan's age now. He thought about Arthur Pierce, a man he barely remembered, a man who had existed in his childhood mostly as a warm presence, and then an absence, a man he knew through a handful of photographs and the second-hand accounts of people who had said he was good at what he did, but hadn't said much more than that. He thought about what it cost to walk away from 3 years of work, from a career that was clearly going somewhere, from the recognition that should have come with it, and say nothing. To just absorb the loss of it and keep quiet. He sacrificed his career, Nolan said. To Shaw, really. Mostly to himself. He sacrificed his career and his reputation, and I think a great deal of his confidence in what the industry could offer him. Shaw's voice was careful. The Nolan Pierce I've read about, in whatever thin record exists, had a fairly quiet professional life after 1971. Local work, small shops, nothing that matched what he'd been doing. He fixed tractors, Nolan said, and school buses. He had a shop outside of Millhaven. I went there once when I was small. I remember there was oil on the floor that had been there so long it looked like it was part of the floor. Shaw was quiet. He never talked about the earlier work, Nolan continued. I asked him once, when I was maybe 8, why there were no pictures of cars in the shop. Mechanics have pictures. He said he'd worked on things that belonged to other people, and it wasn't his to show off. He paused. I thought that was just something he believed about humility. It was, Shaw said quietly. Maybe it was both things at once. Turned back from the window. How long have you known about the Phantom Arrow? Shaw's expression shifted in the way of a man who had been waiting for a question and had known for a while that it was coming. I've known the story for about 15 years, he said. Carr's disappearance was documented in private correspondence I came across during an archive project in 2009. Arthur Pierce was involved. I didn't know what he'd done with the prototype, but he did. The general assumption among the few people who knew the history was that he'd followed orders and destroyed it. He paused. I had no reason to think otherwise until you sent me those photographs. Sat back down. And you're sure? Looking at what's in my driveway, you're sure? I'm not sure of anything until I get that panel open, Shaw said. But those frame welds, the chassis dimensions, I can estimate from the photos. The weight distribution you described, on the drive home, every one of those things points to the same answer. He looked at Nolan with the directness of a man who'd gotten old enough to stop softening things unnecessarily. He'd intervened. I think your father put it in that warehouse in 9971 and sealed it up and walked away from it. I think he left it where he thought it might survive. And I think the registration sticker with those letters on it was not an accident. Thought about that. Not an accident. His father, 31 years old, deciding that a machine he'd spent 3 years building shouldn't be destroyed, finding somewhere to put it, leaving a trace of himself on the paperwork, deliberately just enough, too much. It was the kind of careful thinking that a man did when he believed someone might look someday, but wasn't certain enough to make it easy. He thought about the woman in the parking lot of the auction house, her face in the morning light, something around the edges that was off. He thought about the offer she'd made. $20,000, quickly, smoothly, like she'd had the number ready. She hadn't known the car existed, that was his guess. She'd come to the auction because something in the lot listing had flagged a chassis size, a frame specification, something in the miscellaneous description that matched something in a file somewhere. Kind of thing that a company like Carrington Automotive might have someone monitoring for. She'd come to buy it quietly and make it disappear again. She hadn't known what she was looking at until he'd refused to sell, and then his refusal had told her everything she needed to know. She's going to come at this legally, Nolan said. Almost certainly. Can she do that? Can she make a legal argument for ownership of something her grandfather ordered destroyed? Shaw spread his hands. I'm not a lawyer. I know automotive history. He paused. What I can tell you is that the claim would be complicated, and the litigation would be expensive, and it would take time you'd have to survive financially. Thought about the shop, about the roof, about the leak that he'd patched but hadn't fixed. "'Kay," he said. "Then we need to know what's actually in there before she moves." Shaw nodded slowly. "I agree, but I want to do this carefully. If I'm right, if it's really what I think it is, then how we open that panel matters. Witnesses matter. Documentation matters." He looked at Nolan steadily. "Your father spent 50 years protecting this thing. You don't want to undo that carelessly. How long do you need? Give me 2 days to make some calls. There are people I trust, a certified appraiser named Julian Park, a couple of historians. If we're going to do this, let's do it properly." Nolan agreed. He walked Shaw back out to the driveway, and the old man stood in front of the trailer for another long moment before getting in his Jaguar, just looking at it, with something that was not quite reverence, but was close to it. "Your father was a remarkable craftsman," Shaw said through the open car window. "I hope you get to see the work." He drove away, and Nolan stood in the driveway alone. He had his phone in his pocket, and he pulled it out and looked at the screen. There was a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize, received during the hour he'd been sitting with Shaw. Played it. The voice was female, professional, the particular cadence of someone accustomed to leaving messages that carried weight. "Mr. Pierce, this is Catherine Voss, calling on behalf of Carrington Automotive and Ms. Brielle Carrington. We'd like to discuss the property you recently acquired at the Greenford liquidation auction. No, Ms. Carrington has authorized an offer of $25,000 for the trailer, as is no conditions. If you could return this call at your earliest convenience, we'd appreciate it. Thank you." He listened to it twice. Then he saved the number and put his phone back in his pocket and went into the garage to start his workday. There was a Buick Enclave with a transmission issue that had been sitting in Bay 2 since Friday, and Mrs. Hargrove, who owned it, was 73 and needed it back by Wednesday because she drove her sister to dialysis on Thursdays. Some things didn't wait because other things were urgent. Pulled on his coveralls and got underneath the car and spent the next 4 hours doing the only thing he knew how to do when everything was uncertain, which was the specific work directly in front of him. Called Catherine Voss back at 2 o'clock from the small office at the back of the garage that still had his father's name on a mug that had come with the property when he'd taken it over. The mug had a chip in the rim that he'd never gotten rid of. It sat on the windowsill and held pens. "Mr. Pierce," Catherine Voss said, with the warmth of someone who had been trained to deploy warmth strategically. "Thank you so much for calling back. I hope we can make this simple and pleasant for everyone." "I'm not selling," Nolan said. A brief pause. "I understand you may feel uncertain about the value of—" "I'm not uncertain about the value," he said. "I'm not selling. I wanted to return your call because it's the polite thing to do." He paused. "If Ms. Carrington has anything else she'd like to communicate, I'm happy to listen. But I'm not silly kid, but I'm not selling. Silence on the line, the kind that happens when a person on the other end is deciding how to recalibrate." "Of course," Catherine Voss said in a tone that had become slightly more careful. I'll relay that to Miss Carrington. Thank you for your time, Mr. Pierce. She hung up. Nolan set the phone on the desk next to the mug with the chipped rim and looked out the small window at the back of the garage. The trailer was visible from this angle, sitting at the side of the driveway, the right side facing him. The locked brass panel, the crude welding over what lay underneath. Picked up the mug and looked at the name on it, A. Pierce, stamped into the ceramic in letters that had faded but not disappeared. And he thought about a man who had made a choice when he was 31 years old and had carried the weight of that choice for the rest of his life in silence, and who had left his son a garage and a mug, and nothing that explained any of it. He was still looking at the mug when Mia came in from school, dropped her backpack on the office floor without asking, and climbed into the rolling chair that was too big for her. Any news about the trailer, she asked. Some. Good news or bad news? He considered this. I don't know yet. It might be both. She accepted this with the practicality of a child who has learned that most answers from adults fall into this category. Can I have a snack? There's string cheese in the shop fridge. She hopped off the chair and disappeared, and Nolan set the mug back down on the windowsill and went back to the Buick. The next 36 hours had a particular quality of surface calm and underneath the surface pressure that he recognized from other periods in his life, the weeks after Mia's mother left, the stretch when the shop nearly lost its lease, the long night 2 years ago when Mia had a fever that spiked high enough to frighten him badly, the feeling of things being in motion that you couldn't see clearly yet, of decisions approaching that hadn't quite arrived. He finished Mrs. Hargrove's transmission on Tuesday afternoon. She came to pick the Buick up and paid him in cash, as she always did, and tucked the change into her purse with the careful precision of a woman who had lived through times when you paid attention to every dollar. You look tired, she said, squinting at him. I'm fine. My husband used to say that when he wasn't. She patted his arm with a hand that felt like dried paper. Whatever it is, get some rest. He watched her drive away and thought that the problem with kind people is that they see things you're trying not to show. Shaw called Tuesday evening. Julian Park had agreed to come. 2 historians he trusted were available. He had also, and his voice carried a particular careful quality when he said this, contacted a reporter named Sandra Reese, who covered automotive history for a national publication. She was trustworthy, Shaw said. She would document without distorting. Do we need a reporter? Nolan asked. You might, Shaw said. Carrington Automotive decides to move legally. Having the examination documented publicly changes what's possible for them. It's harder to bury something that's already been witnessed. Thought about that. Wednesday afternoon, he said. I need a day to sort a few things out. He sorted 2 things. First, he called a lawyer. Not a fancy one. He couldn't afford a fancy one. But a woman named Patricia Odom, who had handled a contract dispute for him 3 years ago and had been direct and practical and hadn't padded her hours. Explained the situation in outline. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he valued in people. If they're going to challenge ownership, they'll likely argue the item was sold in error, that it wasn't the machine shop's property. To liquidate, she said. You'll need the auction paperwork, the chain of title going back, everything you've got. I have the auction receipt. Get everything else you can. Don't talk to her lawyers again without me on the line. A pause. What's the timeline on the examination? Wednesday. Fast. Another pause. Okay. Keep me posted. The second thing he did was go into the garage after Mia was in bed and spend an hour just sitting next to the trailer. He didn't try to open it. He didn't pry at anything. He just sat on an overturned bucket in the dark with the shop lights off, and the only light coming from the street through the small side window. And he looked at the thing his father had built and hidden and sacrificed for, and he tried to understand the man. He didn't entirely succeed. That was the honest answer. His father was still mostly absence and silence, and a mug with a chipped rim. But sitting there in the dark, he had a sense, vague and imprecise the way these things always are, of the shape of the decision his father had made. The logic of it, the feeling of it, the particular kind of stubbornness that is not stubbornness, but is the refusal to let something that has value be made into nothing by people with power over you. He recognized it. He'd been doing his own version of it since Saturday morning in a parking lot. Wednesday came in gray and windy, the sky the color of old aluminum, and by 10 in the morning, his driveway had 4 additional vehicles in it and 6 people he didn't know standing beside his trailer. Shaw made introductions. Julian Park was younger than Nolan had expected, maybe 40, with the concentrated attention of someone who was always looking at things slightly more carefully than other people. He shook Nolan's hand. And immediately crouched down to look at the underside of the trailer with a flashlight, not saying anything for several minutes. Sandra Rice was a woman in her late 40s with a camera bag and a voice recorder and the particular stillness of a journalist who has learned that the most useful thing she can do in a new situation is get out of the way and watch. She introduced herself briefly and then stepped back and let the others work. Park finally stood up and turned to Shaw. "The cross-member spacing," Park said. "Yes," Shaw said. "And the frame gauge." "Yes." They were talking to each other in the shorthand of people who'd already had most of a conversation before arriving, and Nolan didn't interrupt it. "Okay," Park said, turning to Nolan. "I'd like to see the panel." They all moved to the right side. The brass padlock was green and heavy and had resisted every casual inspection Nolan had given it. He'd bought a bolt cutter the day before, not sure what else to do, but Park shook his head at it and produced from his own bag a set of specialty tools that made Nolan think of a very expensive and very legal kind of lock-picking. He worked at it for 11 minutes, his face close to the lock, his hands steady. Then the lock turned. The panel didn't spring open. Nothing dramatic happened. It just became openable, and Park stepped back and looked at Nolan. "It's yours," Park said. Nolan gripped the edge of the panel and pulled. It was stiff, 50 years of rust in the hinges, the resistance of something that had not been touched in longer than Nolan had been alive. He pulled again, harder, and Shaw stepped up and pulled with him, and with a sound like something tearing loose from the past, the panel swung open. The light that came through the opening was gray Wednesday morning light, imperfect and ordinary, and it fell on what was inside. There was a full moment of complete silence, not staged silence, the real kind, where people stop breathing because their brains have temporarily lost interest in everything except what their eyes are seeing. Inside the rough cladding, beneath the rust and the mismatched parts, and the decades of deliberate ugliness, the machine was pristine. Not pristine the way showroom things are pristine. It had age. It had the particular quality of something preserved rather than untouched. The metal had the warmth of color that old things develop when they've been still for a very long time. It was whole. It was intact. Every line of it was precise and purposeful, in the way of things made by someone who was not building to a spec, but building to an understanding. Park made a sound that was not a word. Shaw said nothing. His hand went to his mouth. Sandra Rice's camera was up and moving, and to her credit she said nothing either, just documented. Stood with the panel in his hands and looked at the machine his father had built when he was 31 years old and chosen to protect instead of destroy. And then he saw on the driver's side of the body, in lettering that was small and careful and had clearly been done by hand, a name, a model name, not a project name, a name he recognized. He stepped forward and looked at it more closely, not quite trusting his own eyes in the imperfect light. Rose, his grandmother's name, stood there with his hand about 6 inches from the lettering, and did not touch it, and the gray Wednesday light came through the open panel and lay across the machine his father had built and named and hidden and spent the rest of his life saying nothing about. Park was already moving around the car with practiced efficiency, making notes, photographing details, his voice low as he narrated into a recorder. Chassis construction, consistent with period specifications I've seen, referenced in the Carrington internal documents from 1969 through 71. Frame welds are exceptional, clearly master-level fabrication. Body panels show aerodynamic design elements that were not present in production vehicles until the mid-1980s. He paused. "I'm going to need to see the engine, but based on what I can document from the exterior alone, this is it. This is the Phantom Arrow." Shaw sat down on the overturned bucket Nolan had used the night before, and he looked like a man who had just had 50 years of a question answered. Stepped back from the car, and Nolan stepped in a breath of cold morning air and looked at the name on the side of it again. Strup's. His grandmother who had died before Nolan was born, who he knew from a single photograph that his father had kept in the top drawer of his desk, he had never thought of in connection with this or any other story about this time in his father's life. Arthur Pierce had built the most remarkable automotive prototype of his generation. He had been ordered to destroy it. He had chosen not to. And the name he had put on it, the reason, maybe, that he couldn't bring himself to make it nothing was the name of his wife. Some things, Nolan thought, you protect not because of what they're worth, but because of whose name is on them. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Pierce, Brielle Carrington's voice, not Catherine Voss this time. Her directly. I understand you've opened the panel. He looked around. The street outside the driveway was quiet. There was no car he didn't recognize. You have someone watching my driveway, he said. Pause. I need to see you today. In person. I'm in the middle of something. I know. Pause. Her voice when it came back was different in a way he hadn't heard before. Not softer, exactly. The particular difference of a voice from which something has been removed. I know what you found. I need to talk to you before this goes any further. Please. It was the last word that surprised him. Please was not in the natural vocabulary of people like Brielle Carrington, not when talking to people like Nolan Pierce. He recognized it for what it was, the sound of someone who had run out of other options. 4 o'clock, he said. My driveway. He hung up and turned back to the open panel and the car that bore his grandmother's name, Julian Park, who had been watching him, gave him a look that asked the question without words. Brielle Carrington's coming here at 4, Nolan said. Park nodded slowly. Then we should make sure we've documented everything we need before then. That's what I was thinking. They worked through the afternoon, the 6 of them. The cold and the gray, and every measurement Park took and every photograph Shaw directed and every note Sandra Rice made became a piece of something that had spent 50 years in the dark, coming slowly, carefully, into the light. No. Brielle Carrington arrived at 3:58. Nolan noticed she didn't send a car ahead. Assistant, no lawyer, no Catherine Voss with her warm, professional voice. She drove herself, dark gray sedan that was expensive without being ostentatious, and she parked on the street rather than pulling into the driveway, which told him something about how she'd decided to approach this. The others had mostly cleared out by then. Shaw, at home with promises to send his written preliminary assessment within 24 hours. Park was still there, sitting in his rental car at the curb, finishing documentation notes on his laptop, and he looked up when Brielle's car pulled in and then looked at Nolan with a question on his face. Nolan said, I'll call you. Park closed his laptop. You sure? Yeah. Park drove away, and Sandra Rice had left an hour earlier, and it was just Nolan in his driveway when Brielle walked up from the street. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the auction, not the blazer and the precise jewelry, but dark jeans and a simple coat, and she looked like someone who had spent the day making difficult decisions and was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. She stopped about 6 feet from him. The trailer was behind Nolan, the panel still open, the gray afternoon light reaching in toward the machine inside. She looked past him at it. He watched her face. He had expected a range of things from her: negotiation, controlled emotion, legal language delivered in person. He had not expected was what actually happened, which was that Brielle Carrington stood in his driveway, which was that Brielle Carrington arrow through the open panel for nearly 20 seconds without saying anything, and the thing that moved across her face in those 20 seconds was something complicated and real, and not something she was trying to show him. My grandfather told my father it had been destroyed, she said finally. My father told me the same thing. I grew up knowing about the project, about what it was supposed to be, but was always told the prototype was gone. Said nothing. I got a flag on the auction listing from a search algorithm we run. She finally looked at him. Frame dimensions consistent with specifications in the old Carrington R&D files. I thought it might be related equipment. Something minor. I came to handle it quietly. She paused. I did not know it was the car. When I didn't sell, Nolan said, you figured it out. When you didn't sell, she said, And the way you looked at me in the parking lot, yes. I figured it out. There was a long silence between them. A car went past, on the street. Somewhere down the block, someone was running a leaf blower in weather that didn't really warrant it. "Why are you here?" Nolan asked. "Your lawyer left me a message this morning." She looked at him steadily. "I know." She said Carrington Automotive is preparing to file a claim that the trailer was sold in error. It wasn't property of the machine shop. "I know what she said." "Is that what you want to do?" Brielle looked away from him, toward the end of the block, and he watched her work through something internally that she wasn't going to narrate for him. "I came here because I wanted to see it myself," she said. "Before anything else happens. Before lawyers and filings and whatever comes next." She looked back at him. "Can I look at it properly?" He considered that for a moment. He stepped aside. She walked to the open panel slowly. She stopped in front of it and looked in. And whatever she had felt seeing it from a distance reorganized itself when she was close enough to see the details. The lines of the body, the fabrication work, the name on the driver's side, in careful hand-lettered paint. She was quiet for a long time. "Rose," she said. "My grandmother." She turned to look at him. "Your father named it after his wife? That's what I think." She turned back to the car. "He was extraordinary," she said, "and there was nothing performative in it. I've read the internal files. What he built here, what this machine is, he was working at a level nobody was working at in 1969. She paused. "My grandfather ordered it destroyed because he was afraid of it." "Your grandfather ordered my father to destroy his own best work," Nolan said. "And when my father refused and chose to hide it instead, he lost his career over it." She didn't flinch from that. He gave her credit for it. "Yes," she said simply. "That's what the lawsuit is trying to erase," Nolan said. Again, she turned around and faced him fully. The controlled quality she'd had at the auction was gone, or at least reduced to something more manageable. Yes, he'd intervened, and what was left was a woman who was standing in a mechanic's driveway in the late afternoon, dealing with the weight of something her family had done 50 years before she was born. "I haven't authorized the lawsuit," she said. "Catherine filed preliminary paperwork, because that's what I pay her to do when we have an asset risk. I haven't signed off on pursuing it." Nolan studied her. "Why call this morning?" "To buy time." She said it flatly. "Keep you from going public before I had a chance to figure out what the right thing was." "And have you?" She was quiet. "Have you figured out what the right thing is?" He pressed. "Think I have," she said slowly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to say it out loud yet." Was the most honest thing she'd said since she walked up his driveway, and he recognized it as such. "Then you should think about it," he said, "because I'm not selling, and I'm not letting the lawsuit proceed without a fight. And in about 72 hours, I intend to open this car fully for public documentation in a way that will make it impossible for anyone to make it disappear again." She looked at him for a long moment. 72 hours, she said. "That's what I'm telling you." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've received information they already knew was coming and have been preparing for it without admitting they were preparing for it. She took one more look at the car at the name on the side, and then she walked back toward the street. She stopped at the end of the driveway and turned back. "Your father's letter," she said. He went still. "What?" "When a project was terminated at Carrington, any project the lead fabricator was required to submit a final report. Arthur Pierce never submitted one." She paused. "But my grandfather's files contain a reference to a letter he received from your father. A formal report. A personal letter." She looked at him carefully. "Know what was in it." "The letter itself isn't in the files. Just the reference to it." She paused again. "I thought you should know that it existed." Then she got in her car and drove away, stood at the end of his driveway for a while, after her taillights disappeared, and the evening came down gray and cold around him, and he thought about a letter his father had written to a man who had tried to erase his work, and he had absolutely no idea what that letter said. He went inside to make Mia's dinner, came in from next door, where she'd been doing homework with Dale's granddaughter, and she dropped her backpack and her jacket in approximately the same place she always dropped them, which was not the place he'd asked her to put them. And she reported that she'd eaten 2 of Dale's granddaughter's granola bars without asking and felt bad about it. "Did you apologize to her?" Nolan asked. "Yes." "Then you handled it." She said it was fine. "Then it's fine." He stirred something on the stove. Wash your hands. She washed her hands at the sink and looked out the window at the trailer in the side driveway. That woman came, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the car from next door, she did. What did she want? He thought about how to answer that. Was 7, which meant she was past the age where you could give her vague reassurances, and she'd accept them. But she was also still 7, which meant there were things she didn't need to carry. She came to look at what's inside the trailer, he said. And I think she came to decide something. Decide what? Whether to do the right thing or the easy thing. Mia thought about this while he put plates on the table. Pick, she asked. I don't know yet. She exited this and sat down, and they ate, and she talked about something that had happened at school involving a substitute teacher and a class hamster that had gotten out of its cage during math. Nolan listened and asked questions and felt the particular gratitude of ordinary life going on around the edges of something large and uncertain. After she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his father's name on the mug in front of him and called Patricia Odom. She said she hasn't authorized the lawsuit, he told her. That may be true, Patricia said. It may also be what she wants you to believe. I'd treat the 72-hour window as real and plan around it. A pause. What's your public documentation plan? He explained what he had in mind. Shaw and Park would be there. He wanted more historians, more documentation, and he wanted Sandris there with her publication on record, as having witnessed the examination. He wanted the story to exist before anyone could argue it didn't. That's smart, Patricia said. Do it exactly like that. I'm going to draft a letter to Carrington Automotive's legal team tonight, putting them on notice that you're the rightful owner under the terms of the auction sale, and that any attempt to claim error will be contested with full documentation. Thank you, Patricia. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when this is over. She paused. How are you doing with all this? Not legally. Actually, he looked at the mug. I'm still working it out. Yeah, she said. That sounds about right. The next morning, Nolan made calls. He reached out to 2 more historians that Shaw recommended, a curator from an automotive museum in Detroit who Shaw said could speak to provenance, and a photographer who did documentation work for auction houses, and whose images would be harder to dismiss than phone pictures. He arranged everything for Saturday morning, 2 days out. What he had not fully prepared for was what happened on Thursday afternoon. He was underneath a Honda Civic, whose owner had described the noise it was making as a kind of clanking groan, like it's unhappy, which turned out to be a failing CV axle, when his phone buzzed on the floor beside his creeper. He looked at it from underneath the car. Unknown number. He ignored it and kept working. It buzzed again, twice in a row, which usually meant a voicemail. Finished what he was doing, rolled out from under the car, and checked the messages. The first was from a number he recognized as Carrington Automotive's main legal line, a voice he hadn't heard before. Male, efficient, delivered the message with the rhythm of someone reading from a prepared statement. Carrington Automotive had filed a petition in civil court claiming the trailer had been included in the Greenford liquidation sale in error, that it was not property of the machine shop at the time of liquidation, and that its sale to Nolan Pierce was therefore void. A hearing had been scheduled for Monday morning. A temporary restraining order had been requested that, if granted, would require Nolan to surrender the trailer and its contents to the court pending resolution. Sat on the floor of his garage bay and listened to the entire message without moving. That was 4 days. The documentation event was Saturday, 2 days out. The gap between those 2 things was either enough or it wasn't. Called Patricia. I saw it come in, she said before he could speak. I'm looking at the filing right now. Can they do this in this timeline? They can file it. Whether the TRO gets granted is different. He heard paper moving. The argument they're making is that the machine shop acquired the trailer unlawfully, that it came to them through a chain of possession that didn't transfer legal ownership. It's not the strongest argument I've ever seen, but it's not nothing. She paused. They're also fast, which means they had this prepared before she talked to you. So she came to my driveway while her legal team was already filing, Nolan said. It looks that way. He stood up and walked to the mouth of the garage and looked at the trailer. The panel was closed again. He'd closed it after Wednesday, had put a new lock on it himself, a heavy steel one from the hardware store that was considerably less elegant than the original brass, but considerably more current. She told me she hadn't authorized it, he said. She may not have. These things sometimes go on autopilot once the legal team has a directive from a prior instruction. Or she may have told you what she needed you to believe. Patricia's voice was not unkind. No, which. What I know is we need to move Saturday's event to Friday if we can. One day earlier, the TRO hearing is Monday morning. If we can get full documentation and public record established before then, it weakens the claim considerably. Carr would already be a matter of public record with verifiable witness testimony. A pause. Can you move it? He thought about the photographer, the historians, Shaw and Park and Sandra Rice. I'll make it work, he said. He spent the next 2 hours on the phone rearranging schedules, calling in the specifics of what was happening and why the timeline had changed. Shaw moved without complaint. Park did the same. Sandra Rice, when he explained the lawsuit filing, had a quality in her voice that he recognized as a journalist who has just seen a story become significantly more interesting. Can I bring a second photographer? She asked. Bring whoever you need. Curator from Detroit, a woman named Helen Park, no relation to Julian, said she could drive down Friday morning and arrive by 10. One of the additional historians couldn't make it. The other could. By 5 o'clock Friday was arranged. He was locking up the garage when Dale appeared at the side fence, with the expression of a man who has been watching things unfold from a distance and has finally decided to say something. I heard you on the phone most of the afternoon, Dale said. I wasn't that loud. Your garage door was open. Dale leaned his forearms on the fence top. You in trouble some? Dale was quiet for a moment. Kind where you need help, or the kind where you need to be left alone? Looked at him. Dale Pruitt was not a man who offered help lightly. It would be specific help, practical, and without drama. If anything happens Saturday morning, Nolan said, anything that feels wrong or off, I need someone I trust to be watching. Looked at him steadily. What time? 9. I'll be there. That was the end of the conversation. Dale went back inside, and Nolan went in to start dinner, and the evening moved through its ordinary shapes, while the thing in the driveway sat patient and present and full of everything it had held for 50 years. Noticed he was quieter than usual at dinner and chose with the particular sensitivity she'd developed for, when quieter was real, not to push on it. She told him about her day in her normal amount of detail, which was substantial, and she ate everything on her plate, which was unusual. And when he tucked her in, she held his hand for a moment before letting go. Going to be okay, she said. He looked at her. 7 years old, still in the habit of some things being private, her dark hair spread out on the pillow. Where'd you hear that? He asked. Dale told me when I was over there. She paused. He said you were dealing with something important and that you were handling it right. She looked at him seriously. He said you were like your dad. Nolan sat with that for a moment, his hand still in hers. Dale knew my dad? He said they were neighbors for a little while. A long time ago, she yawned. Said your dad was stubborn in the good way. He kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. For a minute, after she closed her eyes, thinking about what it meant to get in this good way, and how you'd know, from the inside, which kind of stubborn you were being. There was an answer to that. He suspected the only evidence was what you did. Friday arrived with better light than Wednesday actual sun, cold and thin but present, and the driveway filled up by 9:15. Helen Park from Detroit was there ahead of time, which impressed him. She was a small, direct woman in her 60s who shook his hand and then walked straight to the trailer with whose small talk and began examining the exterior, narrating into her own recorder. Julian Park arrived with his documentation kit and an additional camera setup that he set on a tripod facing the open panel. Shaw came with the corduroy jacket again, and a thermos of coffee he shared without being asked. Sandra Rice arrived with 2 colleagues, one photographer and one who turned out to be a video journalist, and asked Nolan's permission before they set up. You're recording this, Nolan asked. If you'll let me. Full examination. On record. You can review everything before it publishes. She looked at him. This protects you, Mr. Pierce. Whatever happens in that courtroom Monday, the record exists. Okay, he said. Dale was on his porch across the fence, coffee in hand, watching. He gave Nolan a nod when their eyes met. The examination took 4.5 hours. Julian Park led it, methodically and without rushing, and he documented every panel, every weld, every mechanical component that could be accessed without a full disassembly. Yes, it intervened. Helen Park confirmed his identifications and added her own assessments, and the two of them together's record that was detailed enough to constitute something that would be very difficult to dispute. At 11:40, Park reached the engine compartment. He was quiet for a long time after he opened it. Shaw came to stand beside him and looked in, and he was quiet too. And Nolan stood back and let the people who understood what they were seeing have time with it before he asked. "Talk to me," Nolan finally said. Park looked up. "The power plant is original and intact," he said. "The modifications Arthur Pierce made to the induction system alone, what's in here, is not what was described in the external project specs." Yes, he'd intervened. He went further than the commission called for. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the particular appreciation of someone who has encountered craftsmanship that exceeds what was necessary. He was building toward something, not just fulfilling a contract. He was building toward what the machine could actually be. Shaw's hand went to his mouth again, same as Wednesday. It seemed to be what he did when something moved him past words. Walked up and looked into the engine compartment himself. He didn't have Park's expertise or Shaw's historical depth, but he'd worked on enough engines to read them the way a reader reads a page, to understand the sentences of how something was assembled and what those sentences said about the person who put them together. He looked at what his father had built in 1969 and 1970 and 1971, working in a shop owned by people who were eventually going to order it destroyed, putting more into it than they had asked for, because he was not a man capable of doing less than the thing deserved. Step back. There was a legal pad on the hood of his truck that he'd been using to make notes. He picked it up and looked at what he'd written that morning before anyone arrived. It was a list of decisions, framed as questions, that he'd been working through since Patricia's call the day before. He'd answered most of them. The one that remained was the one that mattered most, and it wasn't a legal question or a financial question. He went inside the house at 12:30 while the examination continued, and he stood in the kitchen with his father's mug in his hand and looked out the window at all the people in his driveway, documenting the thing his father had made. He thought about what Arthur Pierce had chosen. Not the original choice, the one at the beginning, when he'd refused the order to destroy the car. Thought about the second choice, the quieter one. What to do with it afterward. Where to put it. How to preserve it. How to leave it for whoever might eventually find it. His father had not left it anywhere famous. He had not hidden it in a way designed for spectacle or discovery. He'd put in a machine shop in a warehouse district where it sat for decades in the keeping of ordinary working people who happened to have a storage space they never looked in very carefully. He'd left a registration sticker with 3 letters. He'd named the car after his wife. He had trusted that someone with sense would figure it out. Set the mug down. He had a decision to make before Monday, and the decision was not really about the lawsuits, about the money, yes, even entirely about the public documentation. Those things were practical matters, and he'd handled them practically. The decision was about what happened after. He was still working it through when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he now recognized as Brielle Carrington's personal line. He'd gotten it when she'd called Wednesday. The text said, "I want to talk. Before Monday. Somewhere private, please." He stared at the word please again. Was doing the same thing it had done on the phone, sitting in an unfamiliar position. The way a word does was when the person using it is not used to needing it. He typed back, "Tomorrow morning. My shop. 8 o'clock. The reply came in under a minute. "I'll be there." He put the phone in his pocket and went back outside, where Julian Park was carefully documenting the VIN plate that Arthur Pierce had stamped himself in 1970, and which Shaw confirmed matched references in the private Carrington files that had never been made public. The morning held all of them, the historians and the journalists, and the old man with the thermos and Dale on his porch, and the machine in the trailer, and the thin, cold sun, and for a moment Nolan stood at the edge of it all, and thought that Whatever his father had been protecting, it wasn't just the car. It was this. The moment when someone found it and understood what it meant. Arthur Pierce had spent 30 years in a quiet shop in Millhaven, fixing tractors and school buses and saying nothing about the best work of his life. He'd died without whatever was in that letter ever being explained. He'd been buried as a small-town mechanic when he was actually something else entirely, and the world had moved on without knowing the difference. Did not intend to let that stand. By 3 in the afternoon, the examination was complete, and Julian Park shook Nolan's hand with both of his and said that his written appraisal would certify the Phantom Arrow as authentic, intact, crested unprecedented. Intervened that its estimated value in the current collector market was significant enough that he wanted to confirm the number with 2 additional experts before he put it in writing. "Give me a range," Nolan said. Park looked at him steadily. "Conservative estimate based on comparable sales of historically significant American prototypes in the last 5 years?" He paused. 40 to 60 million, possibly more, depending on how the auction is structured and who's in the room. The number sat in the cold afternoon air between them. "Okay," Nolan said. "That was all," he said. Park seemed to expect more and got nothing, and he eventually nodded and started packing his equipment, and Shaw walked over and stood beside Nolan and looked at the trailer. 40 to 60 million, Shaw said quietly. That's what he said. Shaw was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" Looked at the trailer, at the lock he'd put on the panel, at his driveway and his garage, and the house with the roof that needed work and the back porch that leaned and the water stain in the hallway. "I'm going to do what my father would have done," he said, "once I figure out what that was." Shaw looked at him for a long moment and then did something Nolan hadn't expected, which was put a hand briefly on his shoulder, not a hug, anything demonstrative, just a hand on the shoulder of a man with a complicated thing in front of him, and then he picked up his therma and walked to his Jaguar. The driveway emptied out by 4. Sandra Rice was the last to leave, and she paused at the end of the driveway and looked at him. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I want you to know that the story I'm going to write is about your father. About the money, not about Carrington Automotive." She paused. "I thought you should know that before Monday." "Thank you," he said. She left, and he was alone in the driveway again. And the evening was coming down. And inside the house, Mia would be home in about an hour, and he needed to think about dinner. And tomorrow at 8 o'clock, Brielle Carrington was coming to his shop. And Monday morning, a lawyer he'd never met was going to stand up in a courtroom and try to take everything away. He put his hand flat on the side of the trailer, on the cold, rusted metal of the outer cladding, the deliberate ugliness that had kept everything safe. And he stood there for a moment in the quiet of his driveway and thought about what it meant to protect something, not because you'd be recognized for it, but because it deserved to be protected. Then he went inside to make dinner, because Mia was going to be hungry, and some things did not wait, and the trailhead had already waited 50 years and could manage one more night without him. Brielle Carrington showed up at 7:53. Noticed, because he was watching, not because he'd been waiting nervously. He'd been under a pickup truck with a leaking differential since 7:15, which was the most reliable way he knew to keep his mind from running ahead of itself. When he heard tires on gravel, he rolled out on the creeper and stood up, and she was already walking toward him across the driveway, hands in the pockets of a coat that was less formal than anything he'd seen her wear before. She looked like she hadn't slept well. He didn't say so. Pulled a shop rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands and gestured toward the small office at the back of the garage. She followed him in without comment. He moved a parts catalog off the second chair, and she sat down, and he sat at the desk. And for a moment, they were just 2 people in a small room that smelled like oil and old coffee, and the particular dry smell of papers that had been sitting somewhere too long. She looked at the mug on the windowsill. He watched her, read the name on it. "Pierce," she said quietly. "It came with the shop." She looked at it for another moment, then at him. "I didn't authorize the lawsuit," she said. "I need you to believe that, and I understand if you don't. Your legal team filed it while you were standing in my driveway, telling me you hadn't decided anything yet." Yes, she didn't flinch from it. Catherine operates on standing directives. When I marked the auction item as an asset risk 2 weeks ago, She began preparing contingency legal actions. I didn't know she'd filed until Thursday morning. She paused. Called her Thursday afternoon and told her to pause everything. Pause, Nolan said. Not stop. Pause, Brielle confirmed. Because I needed to understand the full situation before I made a decision I couldn't take back. She looked at him directly. I'm here because I've made that decision. He waited. She took her hands out of her coat pockets and folded them on the table in front of her, and it was a gesture that had nothing to do with composure. It was what people do when they're trying to hold themselves to something. My family did something wrong, she said. Not recently, 50 years ago. But institutions carry their histories whether they acknowledge them or not, and Carrington Automotive has been carrying this one and calling it nothing for 5 decades. She looked at the mug again briefly, then back at him. What my grandfather did to your father, the order to destroy the work, the silence afterward, leaving a man to absorb the loss of his entire career without acknowledgement or compensation, that was a real harm to a real person. And the machine in your driveway is evidence of it. Said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened when he thought someone was saying something they'd earned something the right to say, which was with his full attention and without interrupting. I've been running Carrington Automotive for 6 years, she continued. I've dealt with competitors and regulators and board members, and 3 separate attempts to undercut our market position in the European sector. I've never once had a situation where the right thing and the easy thing were so clearly different. She paused. This is the clearest version of that I've ever seen. What does the right thing look like? Nolan asked. Dropping the lawsuit. Completely. Not pausing, not withdrawing without prejudice, dropping it. She met his eyes. Publicly acknowledging that you are the legal and rightful owner of the Phantom Arrow. And publicly acknowledging what my grandfather did. The room was quiet. Outside, a bird made a brief decision about something in the yard, and then stopped. That last, Nolan said. That will cost you. Carrington Automotive stock will take a hit. Industry press will run with it. Your board will not be happy. I'm aware of what it will cost. Her voice was steady but not hard. It was the steadiness of someone who has already run the math and accepted the result. I'm also aware that if your documentation event from yesterday runs in Sandra Rice's publication, and it will, because she's good at her job, then the story is already out, regardless of what I do. The only question is whether I'm on the right side of it or the wrong one. She paused. I'd rather be on the right one and pay for it than be on the wrong one and still pay for it. Leaned back in the chair, which creaked in its specific way. It always creaked the same way. A sound he'd stopped hearing years ago, and he looked at the woman across from him and tried to see past the calculation to what was under it. It was calculation. He wasn't naive enough to think there wasn't. A business person of her caliber did not arrive at any decision without understanding the strategic terrain. She was here because the documentation existed, because Sandra Rice was involved, because the lawsuit was weak, and she knew it, because being caught on the wrong side of this story would cost more than acknowledging it. There was something else, too. He'd seen it in her face Wednesday, when she stood in front of the car and read the name on the side. The calculation didn't produce that. The calculation didn't make a person stand in a mechanic's driveway in the early evening looking at a 50-year-old machine like they were doing something they owed someone. Tell me about the letter, he said. She looked at him carefully. I told you what I know. A reference in my grandfather's files to a letter from your father. Content. Just the reference. Why did you tell me about it? She was quiet for a moment. Because you had a right to know it existed. Whatever is in it, it's from your father. To my grandfather. She paused. I thought about not telling you. I spent about 30 seconds thinking about not telling you. And then I told you. No, and I think that was the moment I actually made this decision. She looked at her folded hands. If I was still trying to protect the company above else, I wouldn't have mentioned it. He let that sit. There's something I need from you, he said. She looked up. If we're going to resolve this the right way publicly, properly, with the history acknowledged, I don't want it to be something Carrington Automotive manages. I don't want your PR department to shape the narrative, and I don't want your name on whatever comes out of this as the hero of it. He held her gaze. My father's name goes on this. Not yours. Not mine, even. She nodded slowly. I understand. I need you to say it clearly. Arthur Pierce built the Phantom Arrow, she said. Arthur Pierce saved it. Whatever public statement we make, whatever form this takes, that is the center of it. His work, his choice. She paused. I can live with my family's role in this history being exactly what it was. I'm not going to try to rehabilitate it. Nolan looked at her for a long time. There's a particular skill that develops in people who work with their hands for a living: mechanics, carpenters, he spat, plumbers, the trades in general, which is the ability to assess quickly whether something is solid or whether it looks solid. You learn to tell the difference between a weld that will hold and a weld that will fail at load. You develop a sense for it that isn't magic, just accumulated experience, reading the same signals in different situations. He looked at Brielle Carrington, and he ran that same assessment, and he believed her. Completely, not without reservation. He wasn't the kind of person who trusted completely and without reservation, and he learned to be suspicious of people who offered that kind of trust, but enough to work with. Monday morning, he said, before the hearing, I want the dismissal on file and a joint statement ready to go to Sandra Rice. I can make that happen, and I want to be the one who decides what happens with the car. Courts, not your company, not any auction house you have a relationship with. He kept his voice even. Mine. It's your property, she said simply. It was your property the moment you paid $700 at that auction. Hasn't changed. He nodded once. She stood up. He stood too, and they were both standing in the small office, and neither of them quite knew how to end a conversation that had covered this much ground in 20 minutes. She looked at the mug one more time. When the time is right, she said, whatever you decide to do with the car, I'd like to be part of, making sure Arthur Pierce's name is attached to it properly. As Carrington Automotive. She paused, as someone who wants to correct what was done. He looked at her. That's a conversation for after Monday. Fair enough. She left. He watched her car pull onto the street and disappear, and then he turned around and looked at the shop and the mug on the windowsill and the truck with the leaking differential that was still waiting for him. And he went back to work. He was still under the truck at noon when his phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Odom. Carrington's legal team just contacted me. They're filing a voluntary dismissal this afternoon. Full withdrawal. She actually did it. He read the text twice, lying on the creeper under a pickup truck with oil on his hands, and the thing he felt was not triumph. Some intervened. It was something quieter and harder to name, something like the particular exhale that comes after you've been holding your breath for longer than you realized. He typed back, okay, Monday still happens. Patricia replied, absolutely. We document the dismissal and proceed with the public event exactly as planned. This is better for you, not worse. She's on record now. Put the phone back in his pocket and went back to the differential. The public event happened. The following Tuesday, they'd pushed it one day to allow the dismissal to be fully processed and on the public record before the unveiling. Had spent Sunday and Monday working with Shaw and Sandra Rice and Patricia Odom on the logistics, which were more complicated than he'd expected. Sandra's piece would run simultaneously with the event, which meant her editors had needed to review the documentation over the weekend, which meant a series of calls and confirmations that ate most of to Sunday. Mia had been told, carefully, and in the version appropriate for a 7-year-old, what was happening. That the ugly trailer in the driveway contained something her grandfather had built a very long time ago. That it was important. That there would be a lot of people coming to see it. She had one question, will I be there? Yes, he said. She accepted this and returned to what she'd been doing, which was drawing a picture of the trailer that was more accurate than he'd expected. She'd captured the proportions reasonably well, which he mentioned, and she said she'd been looking at it a lot. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of fall morning that comes out sharp and honest after a stretch of gray days. By 8:30, the driveway and the street in front of the house were filling up in a way that Nolan found both necessary and slightly overwhelming. Shaw had reached out to his network over the weekend, and what had begun as a documentation event had become something larger, not a spectacle, a circus. Kind of gathering, but the kind of gathering that happens when a story has been moving underground for 50 years and suddenly breaks the surface. There were collectors. He'd expected a few. And there were 12, some of whom had driven from other states. Were journalists beyond Sandra Reese, though she'd been first, and her piece was the one that had established the frame. The others were following her lead. There were historians, 2 museum curators, and a woman who introduced herself as a representative from the National Automotive Heritage Commission, who had driven down that morning from the state capitol. There were neighbors. Dale was there with his granddaughter, and 3 people he'd apparently told about it, because Dale was constitutionally incapable of knowing something interesting without sharing it. And Brielle Carrington was there. She stood at the edge of the gathering, not in the center of it, not drawing attention. She'd come with no entourage, no PR person, no photographer of her own. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she'd had on when she came to the shop on Saturday morning present without being prominent. Noticed her when she arrived, and she met his eyes briefly and nodded, and he nodded back, and that was all. Patricia Odom arrived at 8:50 and pulled him aside. "Dismissal is confirmed on the record," she said quietly. "I have the filing here." She handed him a folder. "I want you to read this before it starts." He looked at the folder. "What is this?" "Joint statement. Carrington's legal team sent it this morning. They submitted it alongside the dismissal." He opened it. It was 1 page. He read it standing at the edge of his driveway, with the sound of 30 people behind him and the cold morning air and the thin, clean sun. The statement was factual and unembellished. It acknowledged that Arthur Pierce had served as lead fabricator on the Phantom Arrow project from 1969 to 1971. Acknowledged that Edmund Carrington had ordered the prototype's destruction. It acknowledged that Arthur Pierce had chosen to preserve the vehicle rather than destroy it, at significant personal professional cost. Acknowledged that Nolan Pierce was the legal and rightful owner of the vehicle by virtue of the liquidations sale. It acknowledged that Carrington Automotive had filed and subsequently voluntarily withdrawn a legal challenge to that ownership. And it stated, without equivocation, that Carrington Automotive recognized Arthur Pierce's contribution to American automotive history and regretted that it had not been acknowledged during his lifetime. It did not use the word sorry. He didn't expect it to, and in some ways the absence of it was more honest than its presence would have been. Sorry was a word that could be said quickly. This statement said something more specific and harder to retract. Close the folder. "It's good," he said to Patricia. "It is," she agreed. "It's also legally binding as a public statement. They can't walk it back." At 9 o'clock, he stood in front of the gathered people in his driveway, beside it, and he said the things he needed to say. He was not a public speaker. In any formal sense, he didn't have prepared remarks written out, and he didn't want any. He said what he knew. He said that his father, Arthur Pierce, intervened, had built the Phantom Arrow in a shop that no longer existed for a company that had ordered the work destroyed, and that his father had made a choice about what to do with the thing he'd made and what it was worth, and that the choice had cost him something real. He said that he had bought an ugly rusted trailer for $700 at a liquidation auction because something about it felt wrong in the way that things sometimes feel wrong before you know why, and that his gut had been right. He said that whatever the car was worth in dollars, and he acknowledged that the number was significant. What it was worth in the other way, the way that didn't have a unit of measurement, was something different. His father had named it after his wife. He'd built it to be the best version of what it could be, not the version the client specified. He'd saved it not to profit from it, but because he couldn't bring himself to make something extraordinary into nothing. He said that he had spent a week understanding of his father as a person in a way he had never fully understood him when he was alive, and that this was a gift he hadn't expected and couldn't have asked for. Then he walked to the trailer and unlocked the panel. He didn't do it dramatically. He just unlocked it, the same way he'd done it, the first time, both hands on the edge. One pull, resistance of old hinges giving way, and the panel swung open, and the morning light came in and fell across the Phantom Arrow, and what happened in the crowd was not applause, not immediately. What happened was the sound of people breathing differently. Was standing beside him. He felt her take his hand. He looked down at her. She was looking into the open panel at the car, her eyes moving across as the person looks at something they don't entirely have words for yet. She was 7 years old, and her grandfather had built this machine when he was 31. And the distance between those two facts and this moment was so large that it almost didn't fit in one thought. She looked up at him. "That's what Grandpa made?" she said. "That's what Grandpa made." She looked back at it. "Beautiful." He looked at it too. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked at the name on the driver's side. He'd shown it to her in a photograph before today, had told her the name and what it meant. She said, reading it herself. Like his wife. Like his wife. She thought about this for a moment with the particular seriousness she applied to things that mattered. He must have loved her a lot. I think so. The collectors started talking about 20 minutes after the panel opened, the way collectors do, quick and specific. Their conversation narrowing down to details, provenance questions, historical context, the implications of what Parks and Shaw's assessments meant for the understanding of this period of American motorsport. The journalists were recording, writing, photographing. Helen Park from the Automotive Museum was standing close to the car with the focused absorption of someone having a professional experience she would tell people about for the rest of her career. Brielle Carrington made her way through the crowd to where Nolan was standing and stopped beside him. They stood side by side and looked at the car for a moment without speaking. "Thank you for the statement," he said. "It's the accurate version of events," she said. "That's all it is." "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." She was quiet for a moment. "My board is going to require 3 separate meetings about this." "I imagine so." The stock dipped 4 points this morning when the press release went out. He looked at her. "Are you telling me this because you want sympathy, or because you want me to know you followed through anyway?" She was quiet for a second, and then, unexpectedly, she almost smiled. It was small and it didn't quite complete itself, but it was real. "The second one," she said. "Then I hear you." The bidding began informally around 11 o'clock, when the collectors had gotten through their initial assessment, and the word had spread further than the driveway. Sandra Rice's piece had gone live at 9:30, and by 11 it was moving through automotive circles, and beyond them, and phones in the crowd were showing the article. New people were showing up at the edge of the street who hadn't been invited, but had followed the story to where it had arrived. The first formal offer came from a collector named Dennis Warfield, who introduced himself to Nolan with the practiced brevity of a man who bought and sold significant objects and had learned not to waste time. $50 million, Warfield said. As is where is, full provenance accepted. Wire transfer, whatever timeline works for you. Nolan looked at him. $50 million was not a number he had a physical relationship with. He could say it in his head and sought to understand what the digits meant, and not feel anything attached to it which told him something. "Thank you," he said. "Is that a counter?" "It's a thank you," Nolan said. "I'll let you know." Within the next 40 minutes, he received 2 more offers. $55 million from a European consortium, represented by a man in a very good coat who handed Nolan a card with a number on the back that he said was his personal line. And $60 million from a private collector who declined to give her name, but whose representative was direct and professional, and made clear that the offer was genuine and open for a reasonable window. $60 million. He stood with these numbers the way you stand, with something too large to hold properly at arm's length, assessing, trying to understand the shape of it. Mia came and found him at 12:30, when the crowd had thinned. Slightly, and the formal examination portion had wound down into the slower movement of people talking in groups, journalists finishing interviews, collectors making calls on their phones at the edge of the driveway. She tugged his sleeve. "Are you going to sell it?" she asked. He looked down at her. She was asking directly, with her full attention on him, the way she asked things when she actually wanted to know. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. She considered this seriously. She looked at the car and then back at him. "Grandpa didn't sell it," she said. He let that sit for a moment. "No," he said. "He didn't. Kept it safe." She thought about it more, even when it was hard. She looked up at him. "If you sell it, it goes into someone's collection, and nobody sees it." "Probably. That doesn't seem right," she said. "Seems like it should be where people can see it." She paused. "Like where it's real." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, hair coming loose from its braid, Her jacket unzipped despite the cold because she kept forgetting to zip it, and he thought that she had arrived at the same place he had, by a shorter and more direct route. He walked to where Shaw was standing with Helen Park and the Heritage Commission representative, who had been hovering near him for most of the morning, with the quality of someone who had something to say and was waiting for the right moment. "Tell me about the museum question," Nolan said to Helen Park. She straightened. "We have an existing facility in Detroit. The collection focuses on the development of American automotive innovation, specifically the craftsmen and engineers whose work shaped the industry. We have a dedicated gallery for cars of historical significance." She paused. "Car like the Phantom Arrow, with full provenance and this particular history, would anchor a permanent exhibit." She paused again. "We would name the exhibit whatever you wanted it named. Arthur Pierce Collection," he said. "Yes, he gets the credit. The family name. Not the company. Him. That's what we'd want," she said simply. "It's his work." He looked at Shaw. Shaw said nothing, but he had the expression of a man who has watched a thing he cared about move toward the right ending, and who has the sense not to say so out loud and risk jinxing it. Turned to the Heritage Commission representative, a careful woman named Louise Tan, who had been patient all morning. "What does the commission do?" he asked. We provide historical designation, preservation funding, and public access requirements," she said. "Phantom Arrow receives heritage status, which, based on what I've seen today, there are resources available for conservation, exhibition, educational programming." She paused. "It would also make certain tax implications of a donation to a public institution considerably more straightforward." He nodded slowly. He thought about the $60 million, thought about the roof and the back porch and the water stain in the hallway, and what 211,000 miles meant to a truck that was going to need a new engine in another year or so. He thought about his father, fixing tractors and school buses in a quiet shop in Millhaven, saying nothing about the best work of his life. Thought about the name on the side of the car. No. He looked across the driveway and found Brielle Carrington, who was standing near the street, talking to Sandra Race with the focused quality of someone giving an interview she'd prepared herself for, but that was still harder than she'd expected. She caught his eye briefly across the distance. He made a decision. He walked over to where Dennis Warfield was standing with his phone and interrupted politely. "Mr. Warfield." Warfield turned attentive. "I appreciate your offer," Nolan said. "Car isn't for sale." Warfield looked at him for a moment with the expression of a collector who has been told no before and knows how to absorb it, and then he nodded once with a precision that suggested respect, if not agreement. "The European Consortium," he asked. "Not for sale." "Private buyer at 60? "Not for sale." Warfield nodded again. "I ask what you intend to do with it." Looked at the Phantom Arrow, sitting in the November light in his driveway. The panel open. The name of his grandmother in careful hand-lettered paint on the driver's side. No, the work of a man who had been 31 years old and had decided that some things were worth protecting not because of what they'd bring, but because of what they were. "Put it where it belongs," Nolan said, "where people can see it." Warfield considered this, and then he did something unexpected, which was extend his hand. "Arthur Pierce deserves that," Warfield said. Nolan shook it. He walked across the driveway to where Mia was standing near the open trailer, looking at the car with the patient absorption of a child who has decided something is worth looking at for a long time. "I'm not selling it," he said. She looked up at him. She said, as if she'd already known. He put his hand on the top of her head, briefly, and she allowed it. She only did when she was okay with something. Across the driveway, Sandra Reese had finished with Brielle Carrington and was moving toward him with her recorder. The morning was getting toward afternoon. The crowd had the changed quality of people who have witnessed something and are beginning to understand what they witnessed. His father had kept a secret for 50 years. Not out of shame, Nolan understood now. Out of the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that some things should survive and who was willing to carry the cost of that belief without asking anyone else to carry it with him. Cost had been real. The silence had been real. The years in the quiet shop in Millhaven had been real. Carr was also real. It was here, and it bore the name of the woman Arthur Pierce had loved enough to put on the best work of his life. World was about to know all of it. Thought his father would consider that a reasonable outcome for a 50-year investment. He wasn't entirely sure. He had not known his father well enough to be certain of anything about him except that he was careful, yet and stubborn, and had loved his wife enough to name something extraordinary after her. Was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Sandra Assis's piece ran in full on Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning it had been picked up by 14 other publications. Knew this because Shaw called him at 7:15 to tell him, and because his phone had been making noises since before his alarm went off, and because Dale knocked on his back door at 7:45 with a printed copy of the article that his granddaughter had driven to the all-night pharmacy to print for him, because Dale did not own a printer and had decided this was kind of thing that deserved to exist on paper. Front page of the automotive section, Dale said, holding it up, and the digital version is everywhere. Nolan took the printout and read it at the kitchen table while his coffee brewed. Sandra had done what she'd said she would do. The center of it was Arthur Pierce. His name appeared in the first sentence and the last sentence, and many of the sentences in between. The Phantom Arrow was described in the technical detail that Park and Shaw had provided. But the story Sandra had written was not a story about a car. It was a story about a man who had built something extraordinary and been ordered to destroy it, and had chosen quietly and at personal cost not to. She had gotten the details right. She had not sentimentalized them. She had let the facts do what the facts did when arranged honestly, which was more than enough. Mia read it over his shoulder, moving her lips slightly on the longer words. And when she finished, she said, "They spelled Grandpa's name right," which was her version of approval. He folded the printout and put it on the windowsill next to the mug. Calls started in earnest around 9. 2 more collectors, both of whom had seen the article and wanted to make offers. He told them both, politely and briefly, that the car was not for sale. Television producer who wanted to know if there was interest in a documentary. He said he'd think about it, which was true. 3 separate automotive publications wanted to run their own pieces. He referred them all to Sandra Rice, who had the documentation and the relationships with the experts, and who he trusted to handle it correctly. Helen Park from the Detroit Museum called at 10. "I want to be careful not to pressure you," she said. "You just made a significant decision yesterday, and I don't want to be the person standing in your driveway the next morning asking what's next." "You're not in my driveway," he said. "You're on the phone." "That's different." She laughed briefly. "Fair. I just want you to know the conversation can happen whenever you're ready. Deadline on our end. I appreciate that." He paused. "I do want to have the conversation. I just need a few days to handle some things first." What he needed to handle first was the thing he'd been putting off since Wednesday. Yes intervened. When Brielle Carrington had mentioned the letter in the parking lot, and the information had gone into him like a splinter present. Specific. Going anywhere. His grandfather's files. The reference to a letter Arthur Pierce had sent to Edmund Carrington after the project was terminated. A letter that no longer appeared to be in the files, but that someone had noted the existence of. Yes, called Brielle on Wednesday afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. "The letter," he said, without preamble. A brief pause. "I've been looking," she said, "since I mentioned it to you. And it's not in the files we have in our current archive, which could mean it was destroyed. Or it could mean it was filed somewhere separately." Another pause. "My grandfather kept a personal correspondence archive, separate from the business files. It's been in storage since he died in 1987. I don't think anyone has gone through it comprehensively. Would you be willing to look?" The question was direct, and he knew it put her in a position that was not entirely comfortable. Rummaging through a dead grandfather's private papers, looking for evidence of a wrong he'd done, was not a task with a clean emotional shape. He wasn't going to soften the ask, though. It was a legitimate thing to want. "Yes," she said. "I'll go through it this week. Thank you." Pause. "How are you doing with all of this?" The attention, the calls. He considered the question. Brielle Carrington asking how he was doing was still an adjustment. "I'm managing," he said. "It's a lot." "It is," she agreed. "It'll settle." "Will it?" Another pause, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that was more personal than he'd heard from her before, less filtered. I've been in situations where something I didn't expect upended the way I understood my company's history. Disorienting. You think you know the ground you're standing on, and then you find out the ground has a different history than you thought. She paused. Does settle, but it takes longer than you want it to. He didn't say anything, and she didn't fill the silence. And after a moment, he thanked her and they hung up. He spent Wednesday afternoon in the garage doing ordinary work, an oil change, a brake job on a minivan that needed new rotors, the differential on the truck he'd started, and not finished when everything began moving too fast. Work was familiar and physical and required enough attention that the larger things had to wait at the edges, which was what he needed. He'd always this about mechanical work. It gave the part of your mind that ran on anxiety something specific to do, which freed the part of your mind that actually thought to do its job without being interrupted. By Thursday, he had made most of the decisions he needed to make. Called Helen Park, and they talked for an hour about what a permanent exhibit at the Detroit Automotive Museum would look like. The Phantom Arrow would be displayed fully restored, not a cosmetic restoration, but a careful mechanical restoration to working condition, documented at every stage. The ugly outer cladding, the rusted shell that Arthur Pierce had built to hide the machine inside, would be displayed alongside it. Helen Park understood immediately why this mattered, without him having to explain it in detail. The disguise is part of the story, she said. It's most of the story, he said. They talked about the naming, the Arthur Pierce Collection, an exhibit that would focus not just on the car itself, but on the period, the people, the specific kind of craftsmanship that had built this country's automotive history and had not always been acknowledged for doing so. Helen Park mentioned that the museum had been wanting to develop programming around exactly this subject, the uncredited and underlauded fabricators, the people whose hands had built things that bore other people's names. Your father's situation wasn't unique, she said quietly. It was unfortunately common. I know, he said. Maybe the exhibit can be about that, too. Not just him. She was quiet for a moment. That's a better museum than the one we were going to build, she said. The formal donation agreement took 3 weeks to finalize, with Patricia Odom reviewing everything and making 2 rounds of changes that she said were necessary and that Helen Park's legal team accepted with each significant argument. The Phantom Arrow would be transferred to the museum's permanent collection, would retain a formal advisory role in the exhibit's development. The Arthur Pierce collection would be the primary designation of the gallery. A small secondary acknowledgement would note that Carrington Automotive had been involved in the original project and had contributed to the exhibit's development. Brielle had offered this herself as a way to soften her family's role, but as a factual acknowledgement that she wanted to be transparent about the full history. Agreed to it. It was accurate. He wasn't interested in a version of the story that was curated to make anyone look better than they were, including him. The letter arrived on a Thursday 5 weeks after the unveiling. Brielle had called first the night before. I found it, she said, in a box in the 3rd storage unit. Personal correspondence, 1971. She paused. I've read it. I need you to know that before I send it, because I think you should be prepared for it. He was sitting at the kitchen table. Mia was in bed. The mug was on the windowsill. Tell me what's in it, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Your father wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't making demands. He wasn't threatening to go public. Another pause. He wrote to my grandfather to tell him he'd made a decision about the car, and why. And he wrote to tell him one other thing. What? That he understood why my grandfather had made the choices he made. That the pressures on a business of that size were real. That the consortium threat was real. And that he didn't think my grandfather was a bad man. She paused. He said he thought my grandfather was a frightened one, and that frightened people sometimes did things they wouldn't do if they had more time to think. Sat with that. He said he hoped my grandfather would find a way to make it right. Someday, Brielle continued. That if he couldn't bring himself to, he hoped whoever came after him would. Kitchen was very quiet. He knew, Nolan said finally. He must have, she said softly. He must have known that the car surviving wasn't enough on its own. That someone would need to find it, and understand it and do something with it. She paused. He wrote the letter because he wanted my grandfather to understand that what he'd done had consequences. But he didn't write it in anger. He wrote it like someone who had already made peace with something and wanted the other person to have a chance to do the same. Looked at the mug on the windowsill for a long time. His father had been 31 years old. He'd just lost his career. He'd just walked away from the best work he'd ever done and hidden it in a warehouse, and driven home to his wife and his future, which would turn out to be quieter and smaller than it should have been. And he had sat down and written a letter to the man who had done that to him, not to demand restitution, but to offer understanding. Arthur Pierce had been a better man than Nolan was sure he himself could have been in the same situation. "Send me the letter," he said. "I'll mail the original tomorrow. I'll have it copied first." A pause. "Nolan, I'm sorry," she said. "I know that word covers a lot of ground and doesn't fix what happened, but I wanted to say it directly, not in a press release." He thought about it for a moment. He said, "Frightened people do things they wouldn't do with more time," he said. "Think that applies to more than just your grandfather." She was quiet. "You came to that auction to make something disappear," he said. "And then you changed your mind. That's not nothing. Took you refusing to sell," she said. "It took the documentation, the lawsuit failing, being out of options." "Me," he said. "But a lot of people run out of options and still don't do the right thing. You did." He paused. "My father would probably have something to say about that." She didn't answer for a moment. When she did, her voice was slightly different, not broken, even close to that, but changed at the edges. "The museum," she said. "I'd like to contribute to the funding. Significantly. Anonymously, if that's what you want. Carrington name anywhere on the building." "I know," he said. "Helen Park told me you'd reached out, and I said yes." He paused. "Not anonymous. The contribution is acknowledged as being from Carrington Automotive as part of their recognition of Arthur Pierce's work. Factual spin." He paused. "My father didn't want anyone to disappear. He wanted things to be what they actually were." Another silence. "Okay," she said. "That's okay." The original letter arrived 2 days later in a padded envelope, handled with the care of something fragile, the paper aged to the specific warm yellow of things that have been kept in boxes for 50 years. Sat at the kitchen table and held it for a while before he opened it. It was 3 pages, handwritten in his father's handwriting, which he recognized from a birthday card he'd found years ago in the back of a drawer. The same slightly forward-leaning script, the same deliberate spacing between words, the handwriting of a man who wrote carefully. Because he thought carefully. He read it once without stopping. Then he read it again, more slowly. It was exactly what Brielle had described. Not angry, demanding. A man explaining a decision with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the decision was right and doesn't need the other person to agree. A man extending to his former employer the same grace he'd shown the car, not erasing the difficult parts, but not destroying them either. Near the end of the 3rd page, in a paragraph he had to read 3 times, before it settled fully into him, Arthur Pierce wrote about the name on the car. He'd intervened. He wrote that he'd put Rose's name on it because it was the best thing he'd ever made, and she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that seemed to him like a sufficient reason. He wrote that if the machine survived, eventually he hoped whoever found it would understand that it hadn't been built for money or competition or the advancement of any particular company's market position. It had been built because the problem of how to make a machine move through the world with minimum resistance and maximum grace was a beautiful problem, and beautiful problems deserved beautiful solutions, and some people were put on this earth to work on them. He had not written, "I hope my son finds it someday." He hadn't needed to. The registration sticker with 3 letters, the name on the side. The decision to put it somewhere an honest person, looking carefully, might find it. His father had left a trail for someone who was paying attention. Set the letter down on the kitchen table and sat with his hands flat on either side of it for a long time. Yet he thought about what it meant to give someone a legacy they don't know they're receiving. Yes, father had gone to work every day in a quiet shop in Millhaven and said nothing about any of this, and in doing so had handed Nolan something that no amount of money could have bought, not a car, a financials windfall, but a true account of who the man had been. Kind of account you can only receive when the person is gone, and the evidence is what they left behind. Picked up his phone and called Brielle. I read the letter, he said. Thought for a moment. He was a better man than I understood when I was 9 years old. She was quiet. He sounds like someone who had a very clear sense of what mattered. He did. He paused. I'm putting the letter in the exhibit. With his permission, his recorded permission in the letter itself, where he writes that he hopes whoever finds the car will understand what it was built for. He paused. I think that includes the letter. I think it does too, she said. The Arthur Pierce collection opened 14 months later, on a Saturday, in early spring, in a dedicated gallery in the Detroit Automotive Museum that smelled like preservation materials and careful climate control and the specific clean air of spaces where things are being kept safe on purpose. Stood in the entrance of the gallery for a moment, before it opened to the public. Just him and Mia, who was now 9, had grown 2 inches and was currently wearing her good shoes under protest. The Phantom Arrow sat at the center of the space, fully restored, every line of it visible. The name Rose on the driver's side and the careful and his father had put there, by hand in 1970. Beside it, on a platform with its own lighting, sat the rusted outer shell, the ugly cladding, the mismatched wheel covers, the sloppy welds over the careful ones, preserved exactly as it had come off the trailer. Plaque between them read, "The machine and the disguise that kept it safe are part of the story." Helen Park had written those words. He'd approved them in about 5 seconds. Behind the car, in a case with archival glass, were 3 things. First was the original registration sticker from the trailer tongue, preserved in its partial state, the 3 letters visible, PIE, the rest gone. No. The second, Subtine Finde, the second of a photograph of Arthur Pierce taken sometime in the late 1960s, the only professional photograph that had been found of him working, his face turned slightly away from the camera and looking at something off to the left, with the focused expression of a man who is thinking about a problem. The third was the letter, open to the second page, displayed so that visitors could read the paragraph about Rose's name and why it was there. Stood in front of the letter for a long time. He wrote a lot, she said. He had a lot to say. Why didn't he just tell people? Thought about this. Sometimes the people who need to hear something aren't ready to hear it when it happens, he said. Sometimes you have to leave it somewhere and trust that the right person will find it at the right time. She thought about that with her 9-year-old seriousness. That's kind of sad. A little, he said, but it worked. She looked at the photograph of Arthur Pierce for a moment. He looks like you, she said. Around the eyes. He looked at the photograph. His father, at roughly his own age, looking at something Nolan couldn't see, working through a problem. Maybe, he said. Brielle Carrington arrived 20 minutes before the public opening. Came alone, as she'd come to every event related to this, and she moved through the gallery quietly and looked at each element without rushing. She stopped at the letter for a long time, and Nolan watched her read it from across the room and made no move to interrupt. When she finished, she stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides, and then she walked over to where Nolan and Mia were standing. She looked at Mia. You must be very proud of your grandfather, she said. Mia considered her with the direct assessment of a child who has decided to take a person seriously. Know him, she said, but I know what he did. That's almost the same. Brielle looked at her for a moment with an expression that Nolan couldn't entirely read something that had arrived from a complicated place and come out the other side as something simpler. You're right, she said. That is almost the same. Mia seemed satisfied with this and went to look at the outer cladding display again, because she had a specific interest in the mechanics of how her grandfather had attached the false panels, which she and Nolan had talked about in enough technical detail that she could now identify the specific welding method. Brielle watched her go. She's going to be something, she said quietly. She already is, Nolan said. The gallery opened at 10. People came through in a steady flow that built through the morning, automotive historians and collectors and museum members, and toward midday, people who had simply read the story over the past 14 months and followed it here. Way people follow a story they care about to wherever it ends up. Nolan stood near the entrance for the first hour and then moved to the side because the exhibit didn't need him to explain it. It explained itself. He watched people stop at the letter. He watched them lean in and read it, some of them nodding slowly, some of them standing still for longer than they'd stood at anything else in the room. He watched a man about his father's age in that photograph stand in front of Rose's name on the car and not say anything for a full minute. He thought about what his father had understood, that Edmund Carrington hadn't, which was this, that powerful people who are afraid will try to make things smaller to protect themselves, and that the only reliable counter to this is making sure the true-sized version of the thing survives somewhere. For revenge, not even for justice exactly, for the record, so that someone someday has access to what actually happened and can decide for themselves what it means. Arthur Pierce had made a bet that the record mattered more than the recognition. He'd made that bet with his own career and his own silence and 3 careful letters on a registration sticker, and he died without knowing whether he'd won or lost. He won. Nolan was thinking about this when Mia appeared at his elbow again, having completed another circuit of the gallery. "Dad," she said, "yeah, I want to learn restoration. Like actually learn it. Not just how things break, but how they go back together." She looked at the car. "Can you teach me the mechanical parts?" He looked down at her. 9 years old, good shoes under protest, completely serious. He said, "I can teach you the mechanical parts. And then when I'm older, I want to go somewhere that teaches the historical part, preservation side." She paused. "Helen said there are programs." "When did you talk to Helen?" "This morning." "While you were talking to that journalist." She looked at him with the faint impatience of someone who has been doing useful things while the adults were occupied. "She said I should visit Detroit this summer and she'll show me the conservation lab." He'd intervened. He looked at Helen Park across the room, who caught his eye and raised her coffee cup slightly in a way that confirmed this conversation had happened. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we'll go to Detroit, or okay in general." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to look at the cladding display again. He stood in the gallery that bore his father's name and watched the people move through the space his father's choices had eventually made possible, and he thought about the distance between a rusted trailer in a driveway and this room, and how the distance was not really 50 years or 14 months, but was actually one decision made by a 31-year-old man in 9,971 who had looked at something he'd built and decided it was worth protecting. He thought about what he would tell Mia when she was older, when she was old enough for the full version. He thought he would tell her that her grandfather was not a perfect man. He had no way of knowing that, and it was almost certainly untrue, because perfect men don't exist. But he was a man who had known the difference between what something was worth in money and what it was worth in the way that can't be measured. And when he had to choose between those two things, he had chosen correctly. And that choice had cost him something real for a long time. Eventually, and long after he was gone, it had paid something back not to him, but to the people who came after him, which is sometimes how that works. Always, not even often, but sometimes, if a person is stubborn in the right way and careful about what they protect and honest about why they're protecting it, the thing they saved keeps saving things. Forward in time, this for people they'll never get to meet. 6 months after the gallery opened, a package arrived at the shop. It was from Brielle Carrington, mailed not through any assistant or corporate channel, but from her home address, a label in her own handwriting. Inside was a small framed photograph, the same photograph of Arthur Pierce that hung in the museum gallery, but a different copy, printed on quality paper and simply framed. On the back, in the same handwriting as the label, he had written, "He deserved to be seen." Put it on the wall in the small office at the garage, between the window and the shelf where his father's mug sat with the chip in the rim. Put it at eye level, where he'd see it every day, which seemed right. A man doing careful work in a shop that bore his name, looking at something just out of frame, thinking about a problem. His father, in the only photograph that had survived, looking exactly like a man who knew the difference between what things cost and what they were worth. Nolan went back to work.